Now, it's often assumed, sometimes uncritically, sometimes unreflectively, that freedom of will and universal determinism are, in fact, incompatible. This is not an assumption that should go without saying. There are reasons for denying that incompatibility. We'll come back to that in a moment. But let's assume that freedom of will and universal determinism are incompatible. Then you have a choice. Either you might infer that freedom of will is an illusion, that is to say that universal determinism, being incompatible with freedom of will, as it were, pushes freedom of will out of the picture. Or you might go the other way and say, no, universal determinism turns out to lose in this battle. Freedom of will is something that we're perhaps sure exists, and therefore so much the worse for universal determinism. Those events that are not deterministic are now of two types, apparently. One, quantum events, such as the decay of a uranium-238 atom. Two, the free actions of a perhaps human being. Perhaps there are other free actions that are performed by non-human animals as well. So the incompatibility of freedom of will and universal determinism doesn't yet tell you which one has to go. It might be that freedom has to go in the face of universal determinism, or it might be that universal determinism has to go in the face of freedom. So let's think about strategy number one, that universal determinism trumps freedom of will. It might go like this. On this strategy, we're simply under an illusion that we're free agents, that we ever exercise freedom of will. In fact, we have no more free will than a robot or a clam. This is the doctrine of hard determinism. Determinism is a hard bullet to bite, a hard thing to accept, but it's something we have to accept all the same. It is something that allows us to see that freedom of will is just an illusion. We should give it up on this view, and maybe a proponent of this view might say, in a few hundred years, it's just a matter of time. Perhaps in a few hundred years, people will look back on the 21st century and centuries previous to it and say, isn't it quaint and charming, but silly, those people back then who thought that they had freedom of will. That's something that I'm glad we finally faced up to. Freedom of will is an illusion. We live in a purely deterministic world, and that does not allow room for freedom of will. But here's a problem with this hard deterministic strategy. On this hard determinism, if there's therefore, on the basis of universal determinism, no free will, what sense can we make of such concepts as responsibility, choice, blame, or praise? I noted before, suggested before in the example of the Tourette's event, that if I don't have freedom of will in harming someone else, it seems also inappropriate for that other person to blame me for having behaved badly, for having been responsible, for having chosen, for having been blameworthy or culpable for the action that I did. I might be, in American law, for example, be held civilly liable for such a thing if I caused harm, but if I'm not free in doing what I did, it's going to be much more of a stretch to argue that I should be criminally liable, because criminal liability tends to try to track moral culpability. It doesn't seem like you should blame me for being a bad, vicious, evil, malevolent person for having hurt somebody if doing so is a result of something that's beyond my control. And if hard determinism is true, freedom exists nowhere. And therefore, it's not clear that there's any room for moral assessment, either of a negative kind, such as blame, or of a positive kind, such as praise. It's not clear that we should say that there should be any case in which somebody gets praise or blame. Now, we might still try to find ourselves, we might try to modify the behavior of others in a world in which free will is an illusion. For example, imagine you've got a brand new puppy, and you're doing what you can to make sure the puppy is house trained. You'd like to get the puppy house trained as soon as possible. Now, when the puppy has an accident inside the house, you don't blame it. You don't think of it as malevolent or evil. But what you might do is modify the behavior, perhaps with a gentle whack of a newspaper or a scolding kind of voice. And likewise, if the puppy does well in something you're trying to train it to do, you might give it positive reinforcement. So, in a world in which there's no free will, and we might assume that there's perhaps no free will on the part of a puppy, we can still modify the behavior of the agent. So too, an application to human beings, a world in which there's no free will might allow room for modifying behavior, and even, for example, incarceration and other forms of behavior modification might still be acceptable, so long as there's evidence that they can reshape the behavior of individuals in ways that we see fit. But blame and praise look like they won't have very much hold in a world in which there's no free will, because blaming someone seems to presuppose that they did what they did and they did so freely, and that view is going to be incorrect in a hard deterministic world.